back to Reclining at Table with Jesus. We're in Luke chapter 9 and we're going to look at verse 32 in this episode. We are looking at the prayer life of Jesus, and we see Jesus taking Peter, James and John, three of his disciples, up onto a mountain to pray. And as he's praying, we see that he's transfigured in verse 29, and then in verse 30 we see the two men, Moses and Elijah, turn up to talk to Jesus in verse 31 about his departure and him accomplishing his work in Jerusalem. And now in verse 32 we see that Peter and those who were with Jesus, Peter, James and John, are heavy with sleep. And then it says, but when they fully became awake, they saw Jesus' glory, and these two men were standing with Jesus. I think Luke wants us to see, and Jesus wants to say to us, that we are prone to fall asleep instead of praying. Our spiritual senses could be so sleepy that we're not active in prayer when we should be in prayer. And this is a danger not just for Peter and the disciples, but for us. As Jesus wants to teach us to pray, he often finds us sleeping. Verse 32, now when Peter and those who were with him were heavy with sleep. Now I'm trying to think out, is this negative or is this positive? So let's start with negative, and then I'll go on to a positive spin on this about a disciple sleeping. It's possible to be a disciple yet sleeping. But negatively, the times we see Peter and James and John called to be with Jesus at his highest point and his lowest point, in Luke's gospel we see them sleeping, and that tells me that's a negative. So here at his highest point, where he reveals his glory, how he's altered in verse 29, he becomes dazzling white. At his highest point of glory, we see them sleeping here in verse 32. But then in Luke 22 and verse 45, we see Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane. We know that he says to Peter, James and John again, come away with me to pray, because he was heavy-hearted. And you see here in verse 45 that when Jesus rises from prayer, he came to the disciples and found them sleeping again. And he says to them in verse 46, why are you sleeping? Rise and pray that you may not enter into temptation. So Jesus at his highest point and his lowest point, when he needed the disciples the most, they were sleeping. And that tells me something about us, is that we are prone to fall asleep. We can miss. Notice that Jesus doesn't wake the disciples up in Luke chapter 9 verse 32. He waits for them to come around. And I think, how long was that? How much did they miss of the glory of Jesus? They missed seeing him dazzling white and changing. They missed the conversation in verse 31 with Moses and Elijah. And how much do we miss of the glory of Jesus because spiritually we are sleeping? And this has to be a bit of a poke and a challenge to us to wake up, as the angel has to say to Peter in Acts chapter 12 as he's sleeping in prison. Wake up. And maybe we miss the glories of Jesus, and other people enjoy them because we have a responsibility of our own souls, and we're often found sleeping. Charles Spurgeon this week in one of his morning devotions looked at Isaiah 40 verse 9, and it says, get yourself up to a high mountain. Get yourself up to a high mountain. And Spurgeon says there are many Christians who are saints, but they never climb the mountain. They'd rather be in the coal mine at the bottom of the mountain than to be on top of the mountain. They would rather be in the dark than the light. They would rather eat the dust at the bottom of the mountain than eat the bread of angels and the food of angels at the top. We would rather dress in the miner's clothing than to be robed with royal robes at the top. Yes, Christians, but we're in the dark, not the light. We sleep rather than be awake. And I think this is a challenge to us, that we have to be careful that we don't miss out on our prayer life and experiences the glories and the agonies of Jesus when he needs us to stand with him. And yet there's a danger we're sleeping. But I want to turn positively also. The Lord showed me something, has been showing me something myself. If you want to turn to Daniel with me, Daniel's a prophet of the Old Testament, and if you turn to chapter 8, let's go positive now, because when you do go up the mountain with the Lord and have these great experiences of him and he reveals his glory to us, it does take out of us energy and strength. It can wipe us out being in the presence of the Lord. And maybe that the disciples sleeping with heavy with sleep is because coping with the glory of Jesus takes energy and strength out of you, and praying, wrestling with the Lord, taking hold of him, really takes it out of us spiritually also. And we aren't Jesus who continue with that amount of strength, and sometimes we will see it affecting our physical life, that we may be tired for no reason, not because we're not eating well, not because we're not exercising well, not because we're not sleeping well. It's just that the more we're in the presence of Jesus, there can be spiritual energy coming out of us. And you'll see this in Daniel chapter 8. He has a vision in verse 15, and a man stands before him, probably an angel. And what you see then in verse 18 is, as the angel is speaking to Daniel, he fell into a deep sleep, and he has to be touched and made to stand up, because he loses strength being in the presence of this spiritual being. And you'll see it again in chapter 10. So chapter 10, Daniel has another vision. Verse 5, he lifts up his eyes, he looks, he sees a man again, clothed with linen. He describes his appearance, verse 5 and 6. And in verse 7, and he says then, verse 8, I was left alone, and I saw this great vision, and no strength was left in me. My radiant appearance was fearfully changed. Actually, some translations said he became like a ruin. Okay, it changed, and I retained, verse 8, no strength. Then I heard, verse 9, the sounds of the words, and I heard the sounds of the words, and I fell on my face in a deep sleep with my face to the ground. So sometimes when you go up a mountain with the Lord and you're in his presence and he reveals his glory to you, remember the verse from Sunday night in Matthew 10, verse 27. He says, what I tell you in the dark, speak in the light. What you hear whispered, proclaim from the rooftop. Sometimes when you go to that dark place, to the closet with Jesus, and you climb the mountain, although he reveals his glory and he whispers to us and he speaks to us in the dark, often there can be a physical draining of that process. And I think that's something I've been learning over the last 9 months, especially as I climb the mountain, as I go to the closet, as I get on my knees and spend time with the Lord late into the night. It can take out of you spiritually. So what we go back to Luke chapter 9 with the disciples and verse 32, and I don't want to be too harsh on them. I do think it's here for a negative that we're prone to sleep, but on a positive, the more that we do climb the mountain with Jesus, it will take out of us spiritually. But let me finish with just the challenge for us to stay awake. Isn't it sad that the highest glory of Jesus on the mountain couldn't keep the disciples awake? And his deepest agonies in Luke 22 in the Garden of Gethsemane didn't affect the disciples to keep them awake. Sometimes we're so sleepy and so dead, the highest glories of Jesus and his greatest agonies are not enough to keep us awake. And that shows me how sleepy and how hard I can be to the things of Christ. So I want to encourage you to pray for me, pray for the leadership, and pray for yourself and for the church, that we wouldn't sleep and that we would stay awake. And if we are climbing the mountain and spiritual life is coming out of us, that the Lord would reach out his hand and touch us and put us on our feet as he did to Daniel. So please stay awake, take hold of the Lord, behold his glories and his agonies, and keep praying. So persevere in prayer with me, please. May the Lord bless you today. Amen.